Okay. All right. So hello, everyone. How are you? Get my notes up here. Of course, I can't find the screen. Everyone who's coming in, thank you for your patience. We were having a little bit of technical difficulty, but we are here now. We're all here. Um, so thank you all for being here. Hello and welcome. Today we are gathering in the digital space, but we are being hosted by the University of Michigan-Dearborn. The University of Michigan-Dearborn sits on the territory of Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which is comprised of the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Odawa. And with this, I'd like to begin our program with a humble acknowledgement, which aims to honor the Indigenous people on the land on which the university currently resides. We do this to acknowledge, to honor, and to uplift the first people who stewarded these lands in the past, and their descendants who continue to carry their legacy in the present. To members of the Indigenous community, please know that you are not forgotten. Okay, so thank you all for being here. And thank you for choosing to join us as we continue to celebrate the life and legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We have a really exciting discussion ahead of us today with two amazing professors who will share with us their scholarship at the intersections of race, religion, African American studies, and more. My name is Gerard Wheeler. Pronouns are he and him. I am the Intercultural Program Manager at the Center for Social Justice and Inclusion at UM-Dearborn. And I'm so excited that we can host both of these professors who are going to broach the topics of at the intersection of race and religion. And so as the title suggests, we'll be talking about race and religion, but as an intersectional office and intersectional beings, we will kind of be bringing lots of things into the fold. And so instead of trying to sum up the things we're going to talk about, I'm really just going to make space for our speakers. Before we jump right into that, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So the way the program is going to flow, I'm doing a little intro and some housekeeping, and then I will introduce Dr. Laws, who provides some opening remarks, and then she will in turn introduce our guest speaker, Professor Dumais. And then Professor Dumais will present her scholarship to us, and then once she's done, Dr. Laws and Professor Dumais, we're both professors and doctors, but they'll engage us in discussion and we'll answer some of you guys' questions. And so just so the audience knows, the Q&A feature is active. So please post your questions there. Hopefully I'll play around with it to do the upvoting so we can kind of, if there's kind of similar questions, we kind of focus on those ones. The closed caption feature is active. So you can turn that on or turn that off at your leisure. The session is being recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel for later viewing. And then lastly, the chat is on, but audience members can't interact with each other, but we can see things you say. So if you're having any issues or technical difficulties, message in the chat. It's me. I'm not sure how much help I'll be, but I will try. So no promises, but I will try to work with, try to get us there. So with no further ado, let me introduce Dr. Terry Laws, and then we can kind of kick this off. So Dr. Laws is an associate professor of African and African American studies at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. Professor Laws teaches courses and presents on African American religious experience, Black women, religion, and spirituality, and bioethics. Her research examines social and cultural issues in African American religion, healthcare, and health inequity. Dr. Laws's publications have appeared in the Journal of Religion and Health, Pastoral Psychology, Religion and Politics, and the AMA Journal of Ethics. She has published essays in volumes including The Religion of White Rage, White Workers, Religious Fervor, and the Myth of Black Racial Progress, and the Handbook of Christian Theology and Modern Sciences, and a forthcoming Baylor University Press volume on Christian theology and bioenhancement. Her current project is a monograph on the culture of African American religion in the U.S. healthcare system. Professor Laws received a Doctor of Philosophy and Religion from Rice University in Houston, Texas, and completed a bioethics training and research fellowship at the University of Texas MD Anderson Center. Before her doctoral studies, she earned the Master's of Divinity from the Morehouse School of Religion at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia. So thank you for opening it up, Dr. Lawson, for being here. Because I know you're on sabbatical, so I really appreciate you. So I'll hand it over to you guys, and thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, first I'd like to welcome our guest, and I will begin welcoming our guest because I have the honor of doing her bio. And forgive me for turning, it's on another screen over here, so forgive me if you see the side of my head. Um, our Kristen Kobes Dumais is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Jesus and John Wayne, and she's a writer, speaker, and scholar who explores the intersection of religion, gender, and politics. Her writing is described as, quote, urgent and sharp-elbowed, end quote. And Dumais does not refrain from presenting the hard truths that history has to offer Americans, and especially American Christians. Her unflinching examination of the American church, however, is ultimately a call to confession, a call to lament, and a call to greater faithfulness. An academic by training, Dumais holds PhD in US history from the University of Notre Dame, but she writes and speaks for popular audiences in an entertaining style that is equal parts winsome and hard-hitting. Her bylines include the New York Times, the Washington Post, Daily Beast, Religion and Politics, Religion News Net Service, NBC News, the Christian Century, and Christianity Today. Her work has also garnered extensive national and international attention as a feature on NPR's Morning Edition, the BBC, and in national outlets in China, Japan, Canada, Australia, Brazil, Germany, and the Netherlands. She is a frequent commenter on religion and politics in the national media at outlets such as the Washington Post, Religion News Service, NPR, CBS, Newsweek, CNN, and the BBC. As a speaker, Dr. Dumais has appeared at colleges and universities across the country, including the University of Notre Dame, Eckerd College, University of Iowa, Indiana Wesleyan, Southern Adventist University, Dordt, and at the University of Calgary. Her public speaking has also included the Christian Feminism Today, Seattle's Crosscut Festival, Lenses Reframed, New Begin House in San Francisco, the University of Chicago's Martin Marty Center, and Johns Hopkins Stavros Natros, you'll have to forgive me for that, Foundation Angora Institute, to name just a few. Dumais teaches at the university, at Calvin University, just across our state here, and lives in Grand Rapids with her husband, 3 kids, and a dog named Paco. We are here today to discuss her very successful book, Jesus and John Wayne, and she has also written a new gospel for women, Catherine Bushnell, and the Challenge of Christian Feminism from Oxford in 2018. So to begin our conversation, I'm going to do a little framing for us in that we are still in Martin Luther King week, so to speak. I'm going to give a little framing. When you read her book, you understand that Dr. May talks about her religious upbringing as well as her scholarship. And I'm going to do a little bit of framing in that vein of my own, and just a very short presentation. Elsewhere, our guest, Dr. Kristen Dumais, has said that she began writing Jesus and John, when she began writing Jesus and John Wayne, she did not intend to write a book about racism. But in 2023, the 60th anniversary of a very pivotal year in the racial history of our nation, in addition to the patriarchy and the ignoring of the basic tenets of their faith, it is the racism that she describes that stands out in her book for me. Much of my lens in this understanding of her findings is based on my own upbringing. It was my good fortune to have grown up in a Black Baptist, very traditional church, whose pastor was a founding member of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Beginning in 1956, the Alabama branch of the NAACP had essentially been outlawed. The state's attorney general sued the organization to hinder its operating activities, including the collection of membership dues, and attempted to keep the organization from staging boycotts. These were bedrock activities of the NAACP that gave them the opportunity to set their own path. In the view of the Alabama Attorney General, the NAACP's crime had been to organize and execute the Montgomery bus boycott that began December 5th, 1955, sparked by the December 1st arrest of Rosa Parks, the woman who later became one of Detroit's most famous adopted daughters. Parks was arrested for refusing, as we know, to move to the segregated Black section of the local bus she was riding. The Supreme Court outlawed bus discrimination or desegregation in 1964. So for 8 years, Alabama held this cloud of criminality over the heads of the NAACP. But the ACMHR had taken its place. And so when NAACP was outlawed, a group of ministers simply formed multiple organizations. And worse for the state of Alabama, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights was an affiliate organization of the Southern Christian Leadership Council or Conference, which we know to have been founded in part by Dr. King. Dr. King, as a founder of SCLC, went to Birmingham to reinforce the interests of its affiliate, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. This movement of Black ministers had invited King to Birmingham in order to reinforce their interests in desegregating economic development and gaining voting rights. By the time I was growing up, my pastor had become one of the millions of the great migrants. He had left Alabama for Cincinnati. Of course, of interest to me, all of this was not known to me while I was growing up. Rather, what was known to me was the simple fact that what we were taught on Sunday was to be taken out into the world on Monday through Saturday. So faith-based or faith-inspired political and civic activities are not unfamiliar to someone with my own background. Black churches had participated and continue to participate in these kinds of holistic movements. But what Dr. Dumais is describing in her book, Jesus and John Wayne, is more than a faith-inspired. It is political activity, as she describes, cultural activity that is eye-opening for its depth of messaging, merchandising, militarism, and its prescriptive manhood. She provides a timely glimpse into an old form of faith-inspired movement that has new tools to spread its dimensions of whiteness and exclusivity. Her work could not be more important for our current moment. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dumais.
Thank you so much, Professor Laws. Thank you for that introduction, and Gerard also for this invitation. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. In honor of Dr. King, I wanted to open with a couple of quotations from him. The first one that will probably be familiar to many of you. In his letter from Birmingham jail, he writes, "I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I would agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection." So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? And one more quote, this from 1957. King says, "I am convinced that love is the most durable power in the world. It is not an expression of impractical idealism, but of practical realism. Far from being the pious injunction of a utopian dreamer, love is an absolute necessity for the survival of our civilization. To return hate for hate does nothing but intensify the existence of evil in the universe. Someone must have sense enough and religion enough to cut off the chain of hate and evil, and this can only be done through love." And we know that Dr. King applied this philosophy of nonviolence and beloved community, not only to racism in the United States, but also, and increasingly over the course of his life, to the global context as he became an outspoken opponent of American militarism in Vietnam. That's the context that I want to open with. And that's the context I want you to hear my presentation in. And I think you'll notice not just context, but also contrast. So on to Jesus and John Wayne. Let me tell you how that got its start. I was a new faculty member here at Calvin University back when it was just Calvin College in the early 2000s, fresh out of graduate school. And I wanted to introduce my students in my U.S. History Survey course to the study of gender in history. I hadn't really learned about gender as a category of analysis until I got to graduate school. I had gone to a conservative Christian college in Iowa, rural Iowa, and it just wasn't part of our syllabus there. And once I got to graduate school, I just became fascinated by what I had come to understand, which is that gender is about so much more than my little world, how we discussed it, which was essentially, can women be pastors in churches? And that was, and my church was very clearly, no, absolutely not, or elders or deacons, none of that. I got to graduate school and I learned that gender was also about economics, and it was about race, and it was about power, and it was about foreign policy, and it was so much more interesting than I had ever imagined. And so I wanted to introduce my students at a Christian college to this idea. And what better way to do that than through a lecture on Teddy Roosevelt, I thought. And so I introduced students to Teddy Roosevelt through the lens of gender, showing how he was embodying a new form of masculinity in the early 20th century, one that was very closely linked to white supremacy, that was linked to American empire, imperialism, that was linked to war and to religion. And so I put together this nice little lecture. I thought it went quite well. And after class, two guys from the class came up to me and they said, "Professor Dumais, there is a book that you have got to read." And that book I have right here. It is John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. Now, I had heard about this book. This is the early 2000s. because every single guy I knew in my church, in West Michigan, in the dorms at the Christian college, they were all reading this book. It sold more than 4 million copies. So really, everybody was reading this in white Christian circles at that time. I'd heard about it, wasn't really my cup of tea, didn't think much of it, but I listened to my students. I drove down later that day to Family Christian Bookstore, back when we actually had bookstores. It wasn't all online. And I bought this book here, $20. I opened it up and I immediately saw what they were talking about. The book opens with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, and it presents this very militant, militaristic conception of what Eldridge calls Christian manhood. God is a warrior God, and men are made in his image. Every man has a battle to fight and a beauty to rescue. Right? And I thought, well, this is interesting. And I started paging through. And I started to see how, to my surprise, right, this was a book on Christian masculinity bought at a Christian bookstore. There wasn't much of the Bible in this book at all. Instead, John Eldridge looked to Hollywood heroes and to mythical heroes for his vision of Christian masculinity. He loved random cowboys and soldiers and mythical warriors, and he really, really loved Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart. And that's really what he builds his conception of Christian masculinity on. Every man has a battle to fight. And so I thought, well, this is really strange, but it also seems significant, right? 4 million copies of this book sold. Everybody I knew was reading it. Now, this was in the early 2000s, and this was a time of the Iraq War, right? And at the time, survey data was coming out showing us how white evangelicals were outliers in terms of their enthusiastic support for the Iraq War, for their embrace of aggressive foreign policy, for condoning the use of torture, all of these things. And so I asked what a historian of gender is simply trained to ask, what scholars of Teddy Roosevelt had asked: what might one of these things have to do with the other, right? What might ideas of gender have to do with foreign policy? And that's how this book started. I spent about 1.5 years researching that question in the early 2000s. And then I set the project aside. I did so for a couple of reasons. First, I had a baby and then another baby, and I was trying to finish my first book, and it was all a bit much. And I thought something has to give. But I was also a little bit troubled by a question that I couldn't quite tease out. And that was what I was reading at the time beyond Wild at Heart. I discovered that was just the tip of the iceberg. This was also the heyday of Mark Driscoll, this deeply misogynistic, crass, militaristic pastor that was all the rage out in Seattle and in American evangelicalism more broadly. And the materials I was reading, all the copycat books too, inspired by Eldridge, seemed to me extremist. And so I was torn. Like, do I need to spend years writing this book and make a big deal out of something that may actually be about a fringe movement? Because it sure seemed fringe. And on the other hand, I knew it was very popular and it didn't seem fringe, and I didn't know how to tease that out. And also, as a Christian myself, and as somebody who takes my faith seriously, I had this nagging question: if this is fringe, is it responsible for me as a Christian to draw all this attention to this ugly side of American Christianity, what may well be the darkest underbelly of American Christianity? And so for these reasons, I set it aside. And I will say at the time that seemed like a kind of noble question to ask. I have since reconsidered. But I set the project aside. And it wasn't until the fall of 2016 that I picked it back up again, specifically in the days after the release of the Access Hollywood tape. Maybe you remember yourself that time. At that point, it was very clear that white evangelicals were Trump's most reliable base. And at the time, I was actually working on a project on Hillary Clinton and her faith formation and her faith commitment. So I was watching the election very closely and had been from the earliest months of the primary, but kind of from the other side, and just keeping an eye on white evangelicals, and mostly interested in why they hated Hillary Clinton with such deep passion. But I saw very early on the support for Trump as early as August 2015 already. And of course, in the days after the Access Hollywood tape release, all of this came to a head because everybody was asking, what are evangelicals going to do now? What are family values evangelicals going to do when they have their candidate on tape bragging about assaulting a woman, assaulting women? And of course, we know what happened, which was pretty much nothing. A couple of prominent evangelicals wavered ever so briefly in their support for Trump. By the end of the week, having prayed about it, they were back behind Trump. Weeks later, we saw the notorious 81% of white evangelicals who cast their vote for Trump and handed him the victory. In coming months, years, we saw that level of support hold steady, whatever was happening in the White House, right? That's a story that you're all familiar with. The question of the hour was, how could evangelicals betray their values to vote for a man like Donald Trump? I knew from this earlier research, I knew from reading all of these books and listening to these sermons that was not the right question to ask. What we were seeing was not the betrayal of evangelical values. We simply did not understand what those values actually were. What was at the heart of evangelical family values politics? And I knew that history showed that we needed to center white patriarchal authority at the center of family values politics, and not just any white patriarchal authority, but one tied up in this warrior masculinity. To understand family values, to understand evangelical commitments, and to understand their support for Donald Trump. And in fact, at that time, evangelicals were making plain why they loved Trump. He was, in their own words, their ultimate fighting champion. He would do what needed to be done. He would not be constrained by political correctness or by any traditional conception of virtues. Right? He was embodying a different set of virtues, this warrior ideal. At any rate, I decided the time had come to dust off that old research. And so I wrote a little essay presenting this thesis and published it in the online journal Religion and Politics and timed it to Trump's inauguration. That went viral. And so at that point, I decided I need to do a little bit more with this, particularly because I'd read the comments. And I know you're not supposed to read comments and things like this, but I always do. And what I saw was that white evangelical men by the dozens were weighing in on this piece and saying, this is exactly right. This is it exactly describes my experience in this world. And so I thought there was something more that needed to be done. So I decided to write a book. Now, the first problem if you're a historian and you set out to write a book is figuring out where to start, because there's always earlier chapters that are essential, and it's hard to know how to cut things off. I give a quick glance back to the 19th century, although I could have written an entire book on the 19th century. But I really needed to show my readers that things have not always been as they are now. Right? History is about continuity, but it's also about change. And I needed to show readers that in the 19th century, Christians, white evangelical Christians, had a different ideal of masculinity that was popular, one where a real man was one who exhibited gentlemanly restraint. But there were competing ideals of masculinity as well, particularly in the American South, and evangelicals there had embraced more of an honor-based system of masculinity, where to be a man was to exert dominance over women, children, and enslaved people, right? And so you have these kind of competing tensions. By the early 20th century, you see these somewhat coming together in the tough, rugged masculinity of Teddy Roosevelt, uniting Southerners and Northerners in this more aggressive white model of masculinity. But even then, things change over time. And so in the early 20th century, you had liberal Protestants embracing this muscular Christianity every bit as much, if not more, than conservative Protestants did. With the First World War, you had liberal Protestants jumping on the militaristic bandwagon more than you did conservatives, with the exception of guys like Billy Sunday, who were literally jumping atop. He's a fundamentalist pastor who would jump atop his pulpit waving an American flag. He was that pro-war. But you had a lot of conservative Protestants who were pacifists at the time, who rejected Christian nationalism, the idea that America was God's special nation, because look around you, did it look like America was Christian, right? And besides, to be Christian meant to have your soul saved, and a nation didn't have a soul, right? So things were different back then. It isn't until the 1940s and the end of the 40s with the early Cold War that we see the kind of alliances settling into place that are much more familiar to us today. And we can put Billy Graham at the center of this kind of new evangelical impulse. In 1942, you have the National Association of Evangelicals coming together and saying, okay, after the fundamentalist modernist controversies, conservative Protestants were kind of scattered, had lost their power, at least their power in national organizations. And they were off busy starting their own colleges, their own churches, their own organizations. But they said, imagine what we can do if we band together. And they had a plan. They said, we need to come together and we need to unite, and we need to have networks of colleges, and we need to have national magazines with subscribers in the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands. We need to take to radio. We need to have bookstores across the country to sell the books that Christian publishers are putting out. This was 1942. What is amazing to me, looking back as a historian, is that within 15 years, they had accomplished this and then some. And Billy Graham was right at the center of this. Now, the kind of evangelicalism that he promoted was one that was very patriotic, Christian nationalist. During World War II, that's when he kind of rose to fame as an evangelist. The good war, right? It was kind of easy to put America and American Christians with the good guys, but then especially during the early Cold War by the end of that decade. And evangelicals were at the vanguard of the kind of Cold War mentality and Christian nationalism that was all the rage, because communists, they thought, believed with good reason, were anti-God, anti-family, and anti-American, all of the things that they held most dear. And so evangelicals end up being right at the forefront of this kind of Cold War resistance, very handy to American presidents at that time, particularly Eisenhower. This is when by the 50s, you have Billy Graham in and out of the White House, very tight and unified. And now what's important, though, is that with respect to these values, evangelicals were not different from other Americans so much. This was the Cold War consensus era, right? This was Leave It to Beaver, right? 1950s, post-war kind of this idyllic moment propped up, especially for the white middle class, by the GI Bill. And so white evangelicals were representing values that were aligned with many Americans, what they held to be good and true. Right. And so it was a time of great power for evangelicals who had just been moved from the total margins, right? Backwaters, all of a sudden to the centers of power. And they loved it there. Everything was going great until the 1960s. In the 1960s, all of this starts to unravel. What happened in the 1960s? You have the civil rights movement, right? Extremely disruptive to the status quo for Southern evangelicals. And the majority of white folks in the South were evangelicals, right? We often forget this, kind of keep our history separate, but they're not separate. You have feminism disrupting this gender traditionalism that was linked to traditional American and to national security. And you have the Vietnam War, and particularly the anti-war movement, right? And what we have there is a lot of Americans coming to question American goodness and American greatness. Again, these values that America held dear. Gender was at the heart of so much of this, because what was needed to fight against all of these, all of what ailed America in the minds of conservative evangelicals, was the assertion of white patriarchal authority. Right? The authority of white parents to decide where their children went to school and who they went to school with. No mention was made of the authority of Black parents to make those decisions, right? This is family values. This is the early political mobilization of white evangelicals, was around school desegregation and private Christian segregated academies, right? Feminism threatened to weaken American manhood and thereby threatening American national defense. To defend Christian America, we needed strong men who were not afraid to do what needed to be done. This is the crucible for really this Jesus and John Wayne masculinity. What does John Wayne have to do with any of this? The point is, this was not simply religious in its origin, nor was this somehow contained within American evangelicalism. This is where we see the partisan political realignment that with the rise of the religious right, but also secular conservatives responding to exactly these same impulses. And John Wayne became a symbol during the 1960s and 70s up to the present of this kind of traditional, one might say, retrograde white masculinity. Now, when I was first reading Wild at Heart all those years ago, as Professor Law said, I first thought I was writing a book about gender. I was working on a project about gender primarily, right? About masculinity. And very quickly on, I realized it was also about race. Because I saw how the heroes that these authors like Eldridge and other copycat writers love to celebrate, every single one of them was a white man. And not just any old white man, but particularly they seem to love white men who proved their heroism by subduing non-white populations. And Teddy Roosevelt is a great example of that. John Wayne is a perfect example. If you think of John Wayne's heroism on screen, right? He's defeating the Native Americans in the Wild West. He's fighting the Japanese on the sands of Iwo Jima, fighting the Vietnamese in the Green Berets, right? We could talk about the Alamo too, in Texas, right? Against the Mexicans. He is the good white man with a gun who uses violence to bring order, right? The ends justifies the means. So that is kind of the origins of Jesus and John Wayne, where we see secular conservatives and conservative Protestants uniting around this conservative white masculinity. The book then follows this strand up to the present, taking some kind of interesting detours through the 1990s when we reach the end of the Cold War. Everything is up for grabs. That's when you have the evangelical men's movement, Promise Keepers, actually kind of stepping back from this militaristic posture, or at least questioning it. Maybe feminism is here to stay. Maybe this rugged warrior masculinity is a little passé. Maybe we need a kinder, gentler version. And that's when they came up with the idea of servant leadership and of the tender warrior. Yes, you want warriors, but we need tenderness too. And they advocated what they called a soft patriarchy. They weren't letting go of patriarchy, but they needed to be nicer about it. And then by the end of that decade, you start to see the pendulum swinging back. A number of evangelical men started critiquing the soft patriarchy, saying things are going a little bit too far. You don't, after all, want tenderness in the trenches. And so by the end of the decade, you have 3 books being written. One, John Eldridge's Wild at Heart. Another, James Dobson's Bringing Up Boys. Testosterone is key to masculinity, and you got to teach little boys how to use guns and play with guns and so on. And Doug Wilson's Future Men, where he introduces the theology of fist fighting. All 3 of these books are on the shelves of Christian bookstores on September 11, 2001, when terrorists struck the United States. Think about it. Eldridge wrote, every man has a battle to fight, right? That is the heart of Christian masculinity. Well, that battle was no longer metaphorical, if it ever was. The battle was there against radical Islam. And this is when I had first encountered this literature in the early 2000s, right? And I had seen what this meant in terms of foreign policy. I had seen how the personal and the political came together so closely. And I had seen what that was doing in terms of shaping US policy. Evangelicals were actively agitating for war. They were writing letters to George W. Bush telling him that God would approve and in fact require him to go to war. And in many ways, this is kind of the escalation of things in the wake of 9/11. Further escalated in 2008 with the election of Barack Hussein Obama. And I tell that story in Jesus and John Wayne, and the reaction to both 9/11 and then particularly to the Obama presidency meant that evangelicals were ready to fight and that they were ready to select the warrior who would lead the charge, one who could be ruthless. They needed an ultimate fighting champion. Now, a few takeaways from this longer history. A couple things that the book does, and then I'll turn things to discussion. But one of the key kind of scholarly interventions that this book makes is, how are we defining evangelicalism, right? This is the question of the hour. And what this book does differently is I don't use the standard definition that scholars had used for a very long time, and that evangelicals themselves really like. You know, they plaster it on the page of the website of the National Association of Evangelicals. They like a theological definition. So to be an evangelical is to believe in certain kind of theological doctrines. Biblicism, the centrality of the scriptures; conversionism, this born again experience; crucicentrism, meaning the centrality of the cross of Christ or Christ's atonement; and then activism or evangelism. So you're living out these beliefs in this way. I plan to use that. Every scholar I knew who talked about evangelicalism just dropped that in their introduction and then went on and wrote their book. And I plan to do the same. At a certain point, I realized, though, it wasn't very useful. It wasn't actually describing what I was seeing. The movement that I was seeing was not one that was focused on theology. When I read Wild at Heart, when I read dozens of other books, right, theology in any traditional sense, doctrine, was not at the center of their project. And plus, there are surveys out there that showed that evangelicals are very illiterate theologically. In fact, a pretty large number, according to surveys that evangelicals themselves do, hold views that count as heresy by any untraditional standard. So I started wondering, well, why are we defining them by their theology if they don't even know what that theology is? But especially on the issue of race. Because if you use this theological rubric to define evangelicalism, the vast majority of Black Protestants fit into those boxes. But here's the thing: the vast majority of Black Protestants who fit into those boxes do not consider themselves evangelical, because it is very clear to them that there is a whole lot more to being evangelical than these doctrinal commitments, right? So I started to define evangelicalism. Actually, I don't define it, I describe it. I describe it as a series of networks and alliances. So who is an evangelical? Are they connected? Do they read Christian books? Do they listen to Christian radio? Are they connected to the Christian conference circuit, right? Christian publishing, these sorts of things. That is how we should understand who evangelicals are. To what degree is a person enmeshed in this evangelical consumer culture? That's what I'm interested in. Okay, so culture, more important than theology. I also became fascinated with the connection between militancy and fear. Because in 2016, as everybody's scrambling to explain evangelical support for Trump, one of the leading theories was this extremism that we're seeing among evangelicals is understandable because they are so under threat, where they are so fearful. What choice did they have but to run into the arms of somebody like Donald Trump? But when I looked back historically, I saw that over and over again in Jerry Falwell's church at Thomas Road Baptist, in Mark Driscoll's church out in Seattle, fear was actively manufactured Fear was not an organic response to what was occurring in the world. Fear was actively stoked by evangelical leaders who used that fear among their followers to consolidate their own power and raise money, right? And so you have Mark Driscoll flanked by security guards, right? And telling people that their souls are going to be like, they're going to go to hell if they go to the Christian church down the street, right? This constant sense of fear, using militarized imagery, because if we're at war, then absolute loyalty is demanded, right? And if you are not absolutely loyal, you are a traitor. Also, you need to give all your money, right? It works very, very well. But this really came out clearly when I saw the evangelical, this really weird thing about fake evangelical, or sorry, fake ex-Muslim terrorists. The evangelicals were super popular on the evangelical speaking circuit. These were Middle Eastern men who purportedly were terrorists, jihadists, and then had this remarkable evangelical conversion experience. And now they were on the evangelical speaking circuit, telling evangelicals how ruthless and bloodthirsty Muslims are. They're still around today. Truth is, they are all frauds, all frauds. One of them came to Calvin University, and my colleague, who's an expert in Islamic history, immediately said, this makes no sense. They were sponsored by Focus on the Family. And so he actually called the president of Focus on the Family. Turns out they knew this guy was a fraud and continued to support his ministry, right? So what comes first? The fear is real among evangelicals, but it is actively stoked by leaders for their own interests. I also came to see how important authority was. And frankly, as I was doing this research, it continually surprised me. What I was seeing was extremely anti-democratic. And I wasn't quite sure what to do with that. It's a kind of sub-theme of the book and has become very pronounced in recent years. Finally, the question about what was that original question that I had that made me uncomfortable? Is this marginal? Is this a marginal extremist movement, or is this mainstream? And I will say that as I continued to research the book, my sense of what was fringe and what was mainstream shifted. And some of the respectable leaders who like to think of themselves as mainstream, as the center of the movement, have found out in the last 5 years that they are not, in fact, the center of the movement. Many of them are now without a job. And so this question of who is at the center of evangelicalism is an active one. I will say also that my instinct to kind of protect the image of Christianity, remember that all those years ago where I thought, is this the right thing to do? I have since repented of that, because in researching and writing this book, I saw how over and over again, Christians and Christian leaders had made that same call and had not confronted what was right in front of them. So in the end, when the book wrapped up, my editor wrote to me. It was almost ready to go to press. And all of a sudden I got this email in my inbox and he's like, Kristen, this book is really depressing. And I said, yeah, I know. And then he said, no, this is a problem. You can't do this to your readers. So then I thought, okay, well, let me take a look. And then I responded to him later that day saying, this is all I've got. It's not a good story, right? This is not good, what we're looking at here. And he said, okay, I respect that. And then he came back around again in about the next day or two and said, Kristen, just give us anything. And that's when I reworked the very last paragraph to end with a sentence, what was once done might also be undone. And it frankly seemed incredibly feeble at the time, and it still does sometimes, but I think there's truth in that. If we don't understand where we're coming from, if we don't understand the past, we cannot understand the present, and then we cannot make wise choices about the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that description. This is very interesting. So I have a couple of questions to begin with. So you gave us the definition of evangelical, but I would like if you could maybe just give us give it to us again, and just in your book you talk about evangelical versus evangelicalism, and so it would be really helpful perhaps if you could just kind of go over that a little bit to start up our conversation. It was very helpful, especially in terms of who's in and who's out.
Yeah. Okay. The truth is evangelical and what that entails has changed dramatically over time. So if you're looking at 17th century Britain, or if you're looking at 19th century American revivalism, right? Evangelicals of the present day will look back and find a kind of through line. And the truth is that that through line is not just a through line to evangelicalism, what goes by evangelicalism today. We're leading into the social gospel movement and into progressive Methodism, and all of that are kind of coming out of the same spaces as well. So who's to say, who gets to decide and define what is evangelical? And the meaning of that changes dramatically. So in the early 20th century, you had modernists who identified as evangelical. People like Fosdick called himself an evangelical, which makes no sense today, because evangelicals have played a very strong role in policing, monitoring, and owning that term. There's a really interesting book that's coming out very soon called The Other Evangelicals. And it is provides the history of, throughout the 20th century, all of the groups who claimed evangelicalism who got defined out of the fold around issues of gender, egalitarianism, around issues of race and racial justice, around issues of sexuality, right? Who gets to decide who is actually evangelical, and what does it mean to be an evangelical? And that's where I come in and look at evangelical networks and alliances, right? They don't primarily work through denominations, although the SBC is the kind of, powerful in as much as there is a kind of denomination. The SBC is powerful, not just because of their numbers, but also because of their publishing arm, right? And so what that means is, if you want to, as an author, to reach the Christian market, whether through books or Christian music, much more on that in my next book, actually, you need to fall in line, and you need to observe certain orthodoxies, very few of which are theological, many of which are political, right? And then you can tap that market, and your livelihood depends on it. So that's how evangelicalism works. Are you an evangelical because you attend a particular church? Maybe you're in one of those, mega churches, or even small churches that's just steeped in evangelical teaching, and your pastor is reading John Piper. Or you might not go to church at all, but if you listen to Christian radio several hours a week, you're going to be introduced to this evangelical value system. So as a cultural historian, that's the evangelicalism I'm interested in. It's a question of networks, alliances. It's a question of markets. And we take that popular culture seriously, and then we study it and see what are the values embedded within that popular culture, within that consumer culture. And then it's not just about theology, it's about cultural identity, and it's about money.
Thank you for that. And something I'd like to pose a question that didn't occur to me before I was listening to this conversation, and it occurred to me about the future, right? So one of the persons who is potentially a future presidential candidate is Pete Buttigieg, who, if I recall his story correctly, he felt the call to serve, right, based on 9/11, and yet I think I might be incorrect about that, but he served, right, and he has a family, and he's married, and he's out gay.
Yes.
So he actually fits some of the cultural tropes that are embedded, right?
Yes.
But there's this one big one, right? that would leave him out of the fold. So what can we expect from I'm asking you from your crystal ball. What can we expect from evangelicals based on what can we expect? And I'm going to call it the movement. What can we expect from the movement based on this candidate who the news media has waiting in the wings?
Yeah, I was watching the Buttigieg campaign very closely for these reasons. And what I saw, first of all, in religious spaces, conservative, evangelical religious spaces, sexuality is the dividing issue, right? And so there is very little space to say, oh, on all these other things, he counts, he's checking those boxes. So we're cool with this. Religiously, you're not going to get that in kind of the conservative evangelical base. That said, I was watching him so closely for precisely these reasons, and not just for kind of his pedigree, military, but also for his personality and his tactics. And to be honest, I actually considered early on, if I hadn't been writing this book, I was going to apply for the job opening for his campaign had to be his faith advisor. So I have given this some thought, and we actually share a publisher. So, so I'll just here, Pete, if you're listening, here's some advice. What I saw as his great promise was the moments that he chose to de-escalate the culture wars, which may seem counterintuitive if you're progressive and you're wanting to win and you want to, tap down the power of this kind of reactionary conservatism. The problem is this reactionary populism thrives on the sense of embattlement, right? And so almost any kind of direct front, they are going to use to their advantage. They're going to raise money off of it, and they're going to mobilize voters off of it. What I saw Pete do at his most successful moments in my reading was diffuse the situation. So for instance, there was the Chick-fil-A incident that kind of popped up, right? Chick-fil-A, we all know it's evil, right? Because anti-LGBTQ, they're giving money to these organizations. And Pete comes in and he's like, you know what? Yeah, not a fan of this bias, obviously. But you know what? I still really like their chicken sandwiches, right? I think that is the political approach that needs to be taken. And if he could get out in front of that, and no, he's not going to win over, no Democrat is going to win over the vast majority of Trump's base, of the Republican base, not at all. What you need is a small number of moderates, right? And to diffuse and not to empower the other side by giving them exactly what they want, I think is the best political strategy. That said, I'm not a political strategist, I'm a historian. So take it with a huge grain of salt.
Okay, so we do have some questions. Michelle, a listener named Michelle asks, based on what you've described, evangelicalism is somewhat confusing. How can the word evangelical be removed from its Christian roots, essentially, given what you've described in terms of it is a very specific definition. So can it be? Well, I guess the first question would be, can it be removed? Given that some people would like to be followers of Christ, but don't want all the trappings that are associated with evangelical.
Yeah, I talk with evangelical leaders who are really troubled and they don't want to lose the term evangelicalism. I don't really care if they want to fight for it and and reclaim it, or if they want to abandon it. I don't really have a dog in that fight. But I think that first, for the ones that are like dead set, we have to save this tradition. That reflects a prevailing attitude within white evangelicalism, that white evangelicalism equals Christianity, equals God's truth. Okay. And that is very common in white evangelical spaces. So that even particularly those who are distraught over what evangelicalism has become, to those, I'm like, you know what, just relax. If you're worried, about the fate of the American church or the global church or anything, like, it was never resting on your shoulders anyway, right? You had to talk Christian to Christian a little bit and say, you know what, rather than working like valiantly to try to fix evangelicalism and rebuild the church and all that, like, again, more power to you if you want to do that. But if you're worried about the fate of Christianity, you could maybe just go across the street and find another church where Christianity is doing just fine, right? So just like keep it in mind. But evangelicals have so centered their own narrative and equated it with God's truth that this captures not just the conservatives who believe it, but the critics of the tradition from inside the tradition as well. Now, another aspect that may or may not have been part of this question is, what is political here and what is religious? I don't say that this evangelicalism is not religious or that this is somehow not real evangelicalism, because, oh my goodness, this is what is being preached from pulpits. This is what, if you read devotionals, if you're listening to Christian radio, this whole package is the faith. It is. So I will push back against people who say this is imposter Christianity, or they aren't real Christians, or they aren't real evangelicals. As a historian, I have to say, these are evangelicals, self-identifying, locating themselves in this tradition, and this is who they are, and this is what they believe. And there is no such thing as pure evangelicalism, and there's no such thing as pure Christianity, right? We can just look at what's in front of us.
Okay. We have another question that asks for your location, for your religious identity. Do you consider yourself an evangelical? That leaves out doctrine and organization, but goes directly to identity.
Yeah.
Do you think of that effort to measure this category of people? And you gave part of that answer, but perhaps you have something else that you'd like to ask. And that's from one of our emeritus faculty.
Yeah, there's about one paragraph in the book about my own background, and that was only put in because my editor made me. I was like, hey, I'm a historian, I'm writing this story. He's like, no, you gotta position yourself, not with respect to evangelicals so much, but he wanted to let like the East Coast elites, New York Times folks know that I wasn't one of them. Like I knew something about this world. I'm from rural Iowa. So I'm a bit weird, right? I teach at Calvin University. My mom was an immigrant from the Netherlands. My dad is a pastor and theologian in the Christian Reformed Church, very Dutch, very Calvinist, very much an ethnic subculture. So I grew up not identifying as evangelical. Billy Graham was not revered in my family. We were distinctive, we were better, and we were smarter than evangelicals, right? That's the attitude I came up with. So that said, when I went off to graduate school and started studying evangelicalism, I realized that, guess what? We had just one bookstore in my little town in Iowa, and it was a Christian bookstore. All of the books were evangelical books. I listened to Christian music because I was raised to believe that secular music was sinful. So all the music that I was listening to was evangelical, right? So again, what is evangelical? I did not identify as an evangelical, but I was certainly immersed in evangelical popular culture, not fully immersed, and my identity was never that. So right now in evangelical spaces, there's the kind of ex-evangelical movement, right? People leaving evangelicalism. It's called, deconstruction. My book is, I think, very popular it is very popular in those spaces. I don't personally identify as that because it was never my core identity. And although my faith has evolved somewhat, it's still pretty consistent with where I started in many ways. So in but not of, sometimes I describe myself as evangelical adjacent. That's how I position myself.
Jessica asks an interesting question, which I know you have an answer for. What responsibility do you believe those who are white and theologically Christian have to respond to racism within the Christian community? How can they, I can't say we, but she asked me, how can they better address racism within Christian communities?
Yeah, first of all, a huge need, because racism is, and the centering of whiteness and white privilege, right? We can kind of use each of those terms, and they could apply to different kind of sets of issues, are all endemic to white Christianity. So now I'm very biased. I'm a historian, and I think there is nothing better no better place to start in this conversation, but I'm sure others will, other disciplines will disagree. Sociologists are like, what are you talking about? It's all here. We're the discipline who does this. But no, I'm going to say history is. Read history. And the really frustrating thing to me is, like, this whole anti-CRT movement, right? That has just, like, I watched in real time as that came up. I mean, literally, I remember like maybe 3 years ago, having to Google CRT because that's not my discipline, it's a legal theory. Like, and then when I read about it, I was like, oh, okay, this kind of makes sense, but I don't need CRT to see race because I've read history books. Right. I've read history books of the white church and of the Black church, and I've read history books of the sexual abuse of Black women in the South. And I've read books about white police brutality. I've read all of these books, and these are footnoted, and they're from the archives, and they're from interviews. And I have all that history, and I carry it around with me. And so I see the world differently. The thing is that white Christians and evangelicals in particular have worked really, really hard to control their own narrative. They tell their history about themselves. They publish their own books. They have approved lists of historians. I am not on that list anymore, right? For the most part. And that's why this book has been so disruptive in those spaces, because so many of them were shocked to read this history, to read about Billy Graham not being the racial progressive they thought he was and they wanted to think he was, to read how endemic racism actually is, even to people who quote unquote mean well, to read about, color blindness, as this, the segue from segregationism, right? This is basic American history. What you do with it, we can have conversations, but this reality of this history is uncontested. And that's why this movement, against quote unquote CRT is really to get rid of this history. And I've seen what that does to communities who don't have access to this history. And it is damaging personally, right? Violence is done by people who don't know this history. Violence is perpetuated. It is also very hard to come together as a democratic society when we have extremely differing understandings of where we are coming from and who we actually are, and therefore what needs to be done. So I'm just a huge proponent of read as much history as you can around these issues. It will absolutely change you. It will open your eyes. And then further education is to work, if you are a white Christian, to listen very carefully to voices who are not white, both past and present.
So I'm going to, one of our colleagues, Dr. Ivy Forsyth-Brown, loves your comments. She wants you to know that. And she's very eager to read your book. She has a question about DEI and where it fits. So you've answered part of that, but perhaps you could say a little bit more specifically about how evangelicals feel about race and racism, actually feel about it, and what current efforts there might be for anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion stance from them. And I'd like to add to that, could you even say that in the context of, institutions that are being built or not, and January 6th?
Okay. Oh, so much. So let me first start with, inside white Christian spaces, particularly white evangelical spaces. In the 1990s, there was this kind of blossoming of a movement for racial reconciliation. And the Promise Keepers, the evangelical men's movement, was kind of the center of that. A lot of good intentions, a lot of genuine kind of goodwill, but also real limitations. Evangelicals tend not to think structurally, they think individually. And there was a lot of kind of identifying that racism was a sin, but it was a mutual sin. And so like in these meetings, they would actually have Black men and white men mutually apologize to each other, right? So this is the kind, so you can see some of these limitations. And then this conception of color blindness, right? Very much, I don't see color. God loves us all. And if you are talking about racial injustice, you are making race visible, which is divisive, and you are dividing the body of Christ, right? Now, there was always that kind of resistance, but there was a real movement for not just racial reconciliation, but that into the 2000s, moving into racial justice and saying that it demands more and we have to think structurally. Now, in fact, that was around since at least the 60s. You've got the evangelical left and sojourners and so on. But that has really come up against kind of rough times in the last few years. The space for that kind of programming is almost entirely gone. I go to a lot of Christian organizations and universities and churches. And what was fine 5 years ago, you can't get away with anymore. I've had a talk at a Christian college canceled because community members accused me of being a CRT proponent, right? The president told me, look, I know this is just ridiculous, but I can't take on this battle right now or I will lose the college. I spoke at an evangelical organization, very prominent national organization, a couple of years back and was told, lean in, do your thing, do not hold back. Race is very contested right now. It's a predominantly white organization. This was the racial justice arm that was bringing me in. And they said, do not hold back. When you leave, we'll clean the blood off the floor, was their quote, direct quote. So knowing my audience, I still tried to be, tactful, but still gave my historical talk. Within weeks, that arm had been dissolved. All of those people had been fired, and there was now no movement for racial justice in this major evangelical organization. That is the reality. All of these college presidents, talk to them, the Christian college spaces, they are getting a lot of pressure. I'm at Calvin University. I check in every few months, like, how's it going, guys? Are you, and they're like, no, and they are absolutely holding firm, but they are in the very small minority, from what I can tell, in still holding to systemic racism is real, structural racism is real, it is anti-Christian, we need to act and we need to repent. That is not very popular these days. The movement on the right has been incredibly effective in demonizing that and in squelching it. And it's not just right coming from inside churches. It's collaborative between Christian leaders and Fox News and talk radio, and it works. And then Trump himself, right, very powerfully.
Yeah, I think my big takeaway from your book really was the networking, how much of that's where the structure is. The structure is in the message, and it's very tight messaging.
Yes.
So Joshua has a number of questions. I'm able to, one is a little shorter, so I'm able to work with that one. And his question really is about anti-Semitism, and we've had some here, in the University of Michigan campus he's referring to, but he's asking, how does your research connect with what seems to be hate-filled anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic protests? And I would add, especially based on our campus where we have a lot of MENA students, and you talk about this in your book, Islamophobia. So religious diversity. So it's slightly different from racial diversity, but the religious diversity and the movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On Islamophobia, I can't speak confidently on this, but I'll speak timidly on it. Seems to be a bit of a change that I've observed. That's very odd, from the extreme Islamophobia of the post 9/11 years to seeing potential allies in the kind of moral values, anti-LGBTQ crusades, right? So that's just something I'm keeping my eye on, interesting. And of course, there are folks in the Muslim American community that are pushing back against that, but it seems to be in flux right now. With Judaism, I could have done much more in the book on this, because within conservative evangelicalism, you have a strong tradition of Zionism. But that shouldn't be confused with, that's not mutually exclusive, Zionism and anti-Semitism. Zionism is this kind of idealized vision of the Jewish people, God's people, very much through a Christian lens. And so you can be Zionist and pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian in your foreign policy and really push that as, God's will, as you understand the prophecies in the book of Revelation and all of that, while still not thinking that Jewish people belong in this country. Because really part of the idea of a Christian nationalism is the idea of real Americans. Who are real Americans? They are predominantly white, although you need not be white if you hold to this set of values, right? Conservative, moral traditionalism. These are the people who really own the country and have to reclaim the country. And if you're going along with that, fine, you're welcome here. If you're going to be resisting, then no, you're not one of us, right? This is this notion. Now, where do Jews come into that? There's this idealized notion of they're God's special people, just like Americans are now God's special people. But there's also a trope that goes way back in evangelical history of seeing Jews as part of the global order. And you see this anti-Soros and, talk about against globalization, and they're seen as a secular elite. And so it's a complicated situation, and you're going to have to like look a little more closely if you want to see what's actually being said and how that plays out politically in terms of actual Jewish people in this country.
In terms of actual, I like that phrase, in terms of actual Jewish people. Just a couple more questions. First, another compliment from Deborah Smith-Pollard, who's one of our faculty here. She, again, is very appreciative of the engagement of this book, and she too will be tracking down your book. And then we have a question from David, which is, what are your thoughts on biblical authority? I know you have some. Without the Bible, there's no Christianity at all. But based on your understanding from your research, there's some contestation there.
Yeah.
So perhaps.
Yeah, I will say that I wrote this book really as a historian. Again, I was coerced into kind of self-identifying in the opening introduction. I will say that I have been somewhat surprised. I shouldn't have been, but I have been surprised by how much my readers want to know about my own faith commitments. And what I really try to put out there is like, regardless of my personal faith commitments, this is a work of history. It's research, it's footnoted, and I write about things that I disagree with, things that I agree with, and sometimes you can't actually tell, what I'm thinking. Although this is certainly not a neutral book, right? And historians are very comfortable with the idea that there is no purely objective history, right? So I put my cards on the table, but I also will strenuously assert that, the book kind of stands on its own as a work of history, and you should vet it accordingly. Okay, so my views on biblical authority. So evangelicals will work with a very rigid understanding of biblical inerrancy and often literalism, right? That is not my tradition that I grew up in at all. Certainly biblical authority in taking the Bible seriously as an inerrant guide to faith and life, which is much more loosely understood. I mean, it's hardly, that my tradition was loose, but it's not the literalist tradition of conservative evangelical hermeneutics. It pays attention to genre in the scriptures. It pays attention to context. My tradition is a very intellectual tradition. And so they study, reams of theology books and contested interpretations. And how do we understand, this particular verse in light of the longer history in the core teachings of the scriptures, right? That's kind of the way that I approach the scriptures. So there is an authority there, absolutely, but it is not a narrow, flattened literalist interpretation, which my tradition has always said that does injustice to the truth of the scriptures, because what it does is it flattens these words that were written for very different people in a very different context in a different language, takes one rendition, one translation, and then you interpret it through your own personal experience. That's actually not doing justice to the truth found in those scriptures, right? So I come at it from a slightly different perspective. That said, my tradition is not that theologically liberal. And so it still takes the word of God seriously, but there's more of a give and take, and I think more of a humility before the text.
Okay, and we have just another minute or so. So I'm going to work to close us out, and then Gerard is going to close our session here. So you opened with us. You opened out your talk by giving us a wonderful quote from my favorite reading from Dr. King, and that was a letter from Birmingham City Jail. And of course, we know that he was writing in response to clergy who had written an open letter saying, hey, yes, it's wrong for violence by the white supremacists. They didn't call them that, but the white supremacists who are sitting in our pews, by the way, right? But it's equally wrong to incite violence through your direct action. So as we close out, perhaps you could give us just a few words to help us I'm going to come back to January 6th, to understand this moment where we are in this 60th anniversary of the Birmingham campaign that you so eloquently started us out with. Help us understand what is our task, given the movement that exists that wants us to see what's actually happening in a very different way than some of us are experiencing it.
I love that. So much to say, and thank you for bringing me back to January 6th. And what is our responsibility collectively, individually, depending on how we're positioned. I think for those of us who feel a kind of moral call, whatever our faith tradition may be, we can be inspired by King's call to center love, and love as a radical act. And love, I mean, he's like, we tried war, right? We see that doesn't work. We've tried violence, also doesn't work, right? Honestly, really, let's, try love, but to do love in this radical way places one at risk. And the risk is different depending on where we're positioned. For me, honestly, as a Midwestern, white, female, scholar, mother of three, my risk is fairly small, to be honest, right? Because of my skin color, because of my privilege, because of my, security. But all the time, I'm getting people saying, you're so brave and you're taking on real risks. And, what are you doing for security? And that's where I just think, no. Again, that instinct to pull back, to not speak truth as we see it. Each of us, no matter where we are positioned, has to push back against that, particularly those of us who are very safe. And frankly, most of us academics and most of us white people in particular are really safe, trust me, right? But the time to act is precisely now. One of the books that inspires me a lot and keeps me up at night a lot is How Democracies Die, by Levinsky and Ziblatt. And this is getting back to that white moderate question. And they see that they study authoritarianism and what enables authoritarian or fascist movements to take hold. Because in fact, you've got fascists who rise up all the time, or would-be fascist leaders, right? But they're usually squelched. And they say what makes the difference between coming to power or disappearing, never hearing from them again, is how political parties respond. If they enable them thinking we can gain something from them and we'll be able to control them down the road, that's not a good way. That's bad. That's dangerous, because when you enable them, they become too powerful and there's nothing more you can do. I think that applies to our modern Republican Party, but I suggest it also applies to conservative white evangelicalism, that for too long we've had these respectable leaders, good-hearted people who have not rejected the radicalism in their own midst around gender, around sexuality, around race, still seeing them somehow as my brother in Christ, giving them cover and facilitating, enabling that radicalism to grow and to fester. And now they're the ones getting pushed out of their jobs, right? So where does that leave us? I mean, this is real. The dangers are real, not just what we saw on January 6th or January 8th recently in Brazil. This is a global moment here with very real connections, but also in terms of much more mundane things like voter suppression, gerrymandering, right? Those state level offices, those are the things that I keep my eye on all the time. And so what can we do wherever we're positioned? There are all kinds of things you can do. Here in Michigan, some of my friends worked on the redistricting campaign. Talk about importance. That is fundamental to our democracy. And then come what may with voters, right? We can work on that, however we, want to advocate, but we have to preserve the mechanisms of our democracy. And I think we need to really invest there. So yes, I think that I feel actually much better about the state of the immediate future post midterms, because we have things to work with, but we still have a lot of things to work on.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If I may just clap in my lungs. So, okay.
Thank you so much for the conversation. It was wonderful.
This was really fun. Gerard, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Laws, and thank you, Dr. Dumais. I just really appreciate you guys just kicking off such an amazing program and conversation. Yeah, thank you guys for
And I
making.
apologize for not getting to all the questions.
Oh yeah, sorry we weren't able to get all you guys' questions. But thank you for asking them. We appreciate you for engaging with us. So just to wrap up, thank you all for joining. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. Thank you for engaging in this critical conversation. I'm gonna drop a link for a quick evaluations, a few questions just to help us better these programs as we continue going forward. If you're part of the UM-Dearborn community, we will be continuing the celebration with some on-campus events on Wednesday and Thursday. I just dropped a link for that as well. And then lastly, a link to our YouTube playlist where we will upload this recording. Just give us a few weeks, get things transcripted and all that and posted up there. But again, I just want to thank Dr. DeMay for being here with us, taking time out of her busy schedule, and as well as you, Dr. Walls, because you're not even supposed to be here. But thank you for seeing the importance of this and helping us have a great program and to acknowledge Dr. King and just the importance of his movement. So I really thank you all for this.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for coming, and please enjoy the rest of your day.